If we're going to have peace and harmony and prosperity, it's going to happen between the U.S. and China. And if we're not figuring out how to get along, there will be problems. If you work together, you study together, you'll progress together. And that's where we need to get the U.S. and China. And that's why I think what you're doing at the Bay Area Council is so important.
Before we start, we want to thank, obviously, the Bay Area Council for this great event, and Marvell, Bailey, where are you? The relentless leader, Bailey Dye, who made it happen, and all the other sponsors and speakers throughout the day. And it's been a great event, and I'm very happy to be here with Governor, Ambassador, Honorable Huntsman. Thank you so much. John. Should I call John?
John.
Yeah.
Because you know what, when you campaign for public office, you're called everything, so I've been called everything. So you tend to simplify it to John. No more time.
Throughout the day, we're trying to figure it out. You know, what am I going to call him? He's done so much. But thank you so much for being with us.
It's a pleasure. And so what do you find today when you go to China? And I've watched it very carefully over the years. Not mouse-suited bureaucrats, suits, English, having attended the best universities in the world, and a very intuitive and deep sense of understanding about the United States. Sometimes seeing it in ways that we don't. And you walk out of meetings in the Foreign Ministry, or in the Commerce Ministry, or NDRC, and you're impressed with the level of people who are now running the show. And here's my concern, having been an elected person and also worked in the bureaucracy in Washington. You try to find people in our bureaucracy in the United States who know as much about China as they know about us, or finding members of Congress who know anything about the subject matter, and you scratch your head and you say, we have problems ahead. Because, just to start the conversation, how do we together sit at the table and negotiate any kind of fair outcome when they understand us better than we understand them? You always want to get, in China they would say, a ping ping hung hung, the outcome for any kind of negotiation. It's something that's got good equilibrium to it. And I'd have to say that we have some work to do with the next generation to expose them to China. And this is one of the reasons while I was governor of Utah, I started a Chinese language program in our public schools and an immersion program, for even kids in elementary school. And it became the largest in the country. And I used to tell Governor Schwarzenegger here, who's a friend, we've got more kids studying Chinese in our state than you do in California. And, you're the bridge state to China. And it was just kind of a test trial program that we started in our state, but it became very big because the parents, the moms and the dads, they are looking into the future and they're saying, we want our kids to have a head start. We want them to understand the world in ways that they don't. They get the part about the next generation stepping onto a stage where only the United States and China are the key players in the world. That's the profound difference about the balance internationally today. For the last generation, it was a transatlantic tie. For my kids, I have a daughter from China. I have a daughter from India. She's 6 years old. She speaks fluent Chinese. I have two boys at the U.S. Naval Academy, both studying Chinese. And they're doing it not because Dad is forcing them, but they've also lived over in Asia, and they understand where the balance of the world is. And if we're going to have peace and harmony and prosperity and problem solving, whether it's science, culture, the arts, security, economics, it's going to happen between the U.S. and China. And if we're not figuring out how to get along, there will be problems. And today, we haven't figured out how to make a connection. We're still fumbling around. We use China as a political tool. You hear all this stuff in the run-up to the election. And why? Because when you're a politician and you talk about what to do with China, you don't get any points. You don't get an applause line. When you talk about what you're going to do to China, you get an applause line. And it's a part of the U.S. political system that everybody needs to kind of focus on a little bit through more understanding and more exposure. And that's why I think what you're doing at the Bay Area Council is so important, because you're making connections at the localist levels of government and business. That's sustainable. The Washington and Beijing relationship, they'll be like this for a long time to come. But the real relationship building, you know, having watched it from Beijing and also from this side, is going to happen in our communities, our cities, our towns, our states. And it's going to be where we talk about not North Korea and not Iran and not economic rebalancing, although those are all important. It's going to happen through collaboration on smart growth communities, on transportation, on education, on healthcare, on the things that we need to focus on and that China needs to focus on. That's called, in China they would say, 互相帮忙, 互相学习, 沟通进步. You know, you work together. That's an old aphorism, I think, of the Han Dynasty. You know, Han Dynasty was 200 BC to about 200 AD, and a lot of philosophy, including Confucius, you know, Confucius, who lived during that period, and Bangzi, who lived in the neighboring town in Shandong, took a lot of what Confucius wrote about, transformed it into a code for civil society and civil service. And so that phrase comes from that period, but it's true. If you work together, you study together, you'll progress together. And that's where we need to get the U.S. and China. We're going to have problems. We all know that. And you can work out the problems. But we also need an area of the relationship that's focused on common interests. And that's where you're doing it right.
So, as you were speaking Chinese, I'm thinking about my Chinese, and I can say "sheshe" and "woani." Those are two sentences. I'm trying to compete here, but I'm losing, I think. Very, very deep, obviously, all that experience you're bringing on the table. So, election year, and you promised the audience we're going to stir it up a little bit. So, two amazing candidates. Obviously, you represented the Republican Party in the primaries, and by the way, you were talking about before you arrived, you've done a fantastic job doing those debates, and we really appreciated your common sense approach to economy, to science, to evolution, and topics like green energy and global warming, unlike some of the candidates still don't believe there is global warming. And I just sold my company to Dell, which is a Texas company. I'll leave it at that. Just got back from Austin, everybody says hi. To make the long story short, you were talking about outside a little bit about this topic. I'm going to drill down a little bit further. There are these two candidates, and they're smart men, and they have their campaigns going on and everything else. And China, as you mentioned, is a big topic. Who do you believe has a better approach? Who do you believe has a better approach, not only because of the election, but in the long term, it's going to bring us to the right platform?
Yeah, I don't think that ever happened. I don't think. 我不想回答这个问题。
I'm going to come back to that.
Let me just say,
it's not being recorded, by the way.
Here's the thing about the U.S. and China, and I'm going to take you back just for a minute to 40 years ago, because that's when the relationship started. And all the folks involved in the U.S.-China relationship, they all like to tell you about their involvement at the creation of the relationship. So I've got a friend, you know, Henry Kissinger, who was kind of the architect of the relationship. And another good friend, Winston Moore, who was one of my predecessors as ambassador, who was with Kissinger when they took a secret trip in 1971, July. Well, here's my connection to the founding of the relationship. I was an 11-year-old kid in July of 1971, and my dad worked in the White House for a year, and then he moved on. There's a little bit of a political gene that goes through our family. My grandfather, Haight, ran Palo Alto hardware store, and he later became mayor of Palo Alto, and for 2 years. And my other grandfather was principal of Los Altos High School, not far from here, who believed that, everyone had to be an educator. That was the apogee of success. Anything south of that was failure. So the rest of us have failed pretty much in his eyes. But in 1971, I was one day, I never saw my dad. He was always at the White House working that year. And the only time I saw him was to go there and visit. I was wandering around the White House as a kid. And back then it was totally different, not all the security that you find today, looking for the code machine. And I ran into an assistant to Kissinger's who said, "Young man, would you like to shake the hand of Henry Kissinger?" I didn't know who Kissinger was. I shook Kissinger's hand, he was in the adjacent office, and the National Security Advisor to the President. And said, you carry my bag out in the car, I'm leaving on a trip. Sure, picked up the black bag and walked down to the door, dropped his bag off on West Executive Drive. And I said, where are you going? And he said, "Don't tell anyone, it's a secret."
That was great.
I'm going to China. So, my connection to the relationship, I carried the guy's bag to outside the White House. 11 years old, I had no idea who he was or what it meant to be going to China. I processed it later. But my friends in China call that period 1971, 1972, when we first went in. 中国准备进入世界强. China preparing to enter the world. We had no trade. We were fighting each other in Vietnam, we forget. And a few years before, China had lost 400,000 men on the Korean Peninsula, including the son of Mao Zedong, who was buried there. And it was in the throes of the Cultural Revolution. We had nothing, no connection. And if you can imagine, today's world, the President of the United States flying Air Force One into a far-off country with which we have no relationship at all, a hostile country, and making a relationship, building a friendship. Not militarism, but diplomacy. And Nixon stepped off the plane and shook the hand of Zhou Enlai, and it was a friendship, a handshake that changed the world. And if you track the relationship for 40 years, you have candidates who, during the campaign, I went first to China with Reagan. Reagan said in 1980, "I'm going to pull the ambassador from Beijing and re-recognize Taiwan." That's how deep the discussion got. And China, of course, would have been infuriated. But that was the politics of the time. He was elected president and saw that in order to get things done, he had to bring in China to the conference. And that's the early 80s, when China was not nearly the economic power that they are today. Bill Clinton runs in 1992, and he talks about the butchers of Beijing. Gets on, George H.W. Bush, criticizes him for his pro-engagement policy, gets elected president, and sees the world a little differently. Barack Obama, in 2008, criticizes George W. Bush for going to the Olympics in Beijing. And then people get elected, and the world all of a sudden looks a little different. And so what happens? Republicans and Democrats alike, they get into office, and they see that it's a very complicated relationship. A lot of interests, economic and security and culture and international collaboration. And if you want to fix the issue with Iran and weaponization, you got to get China's cooperation. You want to get stability on the Korean Peninsula, you have to work with China. You want to get, some sense of stability in the South China Sea, you got to work on solutions with China. You want to work on debt issues in Europe, you got to work with China. You want to work on the environmental issues. So, as the world's largest emitter of CO2 greenhouse gases, so as governor of Utah, I used to make the claim, which I think is accurate, that, we're all downstream. And a lot of the stuff that China would put in the air would come across the jet stream, across the Pacific Ocean, land on the doorstep, a percentage of the overall on the coast of California. Some even would blow inland. And I'd say, we can only do so much unilaterally. You got to work together multilaterally or bilaterally to fix the issue.